Welcome to Touring the AFC South. I'm your host, Mike Patton. And of course, within a long NFL season, injuries can occur, some lasting longer than others. And of course, to get a little bit more clarity on two key injuries to the AFC South, of course, two quarterbacks, I figured it'd be time to bring back someone who is well versed in the human anatomy. That would be Dr. Erin Wilson. How you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing just fine, Now, this week, we had a couple big injuries. Of course, the most talked about injured quarterback is AFC South quarterback and Indianapolis Colt quarterback Carson Wentz. Now, of course, he made it back early to camp from the foot injury we talked about in the earlier episode.
Right.
Now, he sprained his one ankle in the first half and sprained the other ankle in the second half. So now he's dealing with two sprained ankles. Of course, right now, the Colts haven't given really any update. I don't think they will. Probably play coy until, game time, of course. I'm just trying to figure out, are those things that ankle injuries, are those something that can actually just linger on the entire season?
Well, for him, it's kind of, we don't really know just because of the previous injury he just had earlier in the year. So he did come back from that. But remember when we talked about it in the earlier episode, depending on how that metatarsal fracture healed and what actually is the true status of that as far as the stage of healing and his pain tolerance, if he's still dealing with that, it can affect the mechanics of the foot, the way he's planning, the way he's walking, the way he's running. So anytime you're kind of altering the mechanics of your foot, it's going to translate up to the next joint, which is going to be your ankle. So we don't really know kind of where he was starting to begin with coming from that injury. But when we talk about ankle sprains, that's such a general term. And so it's kind of hard for, the Colts, and they're doing the smart thing. They're just going to keep everybody in the dark until they really want to release what's going on or want us to know for sure what's going on. Because you can categorize an ankle sprain by either the manner in which it happens, so the mechanism injury, whether you roll your foot in or roll your foot out, or you can either categorize it by the severity of the sprain. So basically a sprain is just an over-lengthening, a stretching, or a possible tearing of the ligaments, the connective tissue that connects the ankle bones together. So it can either be a first degree, a second degree, or a third degree, much like how they stage burns. So if it's a first degree, we're thinking, maybe they'll be back in a week, 2-3 weeks. The common person, everybody's had an ankle sprain, a first degree ankle sprain before. You rolled your ankle stepping off of a curb or, running or anything like that. You can take care of that at home generally, rest, ice, compression, a little ankle brace, elevation. Everybody kind of knows how to manage a first degree sprain. And 9 times out of 10, if it was a first degree sprain, it wouldn't really be much to talk about because from Sunday to Sunday, most NFL athletes can recover from a first degree sprain. Having rehab at the facility twice a day for 7 days, you can generally get back from that. When you're talking about second degree sprains, that's when you might have a little partial tear in the ligament. So you're going to have more pain, more swelling, more tenderness. You might have some discoloration there where it's sprained. It's going to take a little bit more time. And, the severity goes further. When you're talking about third degree, that's when you usually have a tear in the ligament. And so that's when we're talking about something that could be chronic, something where you see people who say, they wear ankle brace all the time. If they're on their ankle too much, it swells. And so it's just a repetitive thing. Ligaments in the ankle typically have a poor blood supply. And if you remember when we talked about the metatarsal fracture, blood supply is key because if you don't have blood supply to the area, then you can't promote healing, then it won't get better. So we're really kind of in the dark as far as what type of sprain it is, the severity of the sprain, whether it's an inversion where his foot fell in when he sprained it, or an eversion sprain where his foot fell out. So all of those things kind of play a role in how you'll dictate his treatment, when and how we'll come back. And because both of them are sprained, we don't really know much of anything. But one thing for sure, I'm pretty sure his previous injury to his foot altered his mechanics somewhat and kind of predisposed him to ankle sprain. I mean, so I'm not surprised.
Gotcha. Now, we're like you said, we're in the dark with what kind of ankle sprain it is. Now, even with that, is there some things he can do to rehab his ankles and make them as strong as possible, even with all the previous injuries and not necessarily knowing what the level?
Again, we kind of don't know at this stage. He did it Sunday, so it's 4 days from now. So during this time, it's still acute. So you still have swelling, you still have pain. If it's a second or third degree sprain, he may or may not be able to put a lot of weight on it without pain. When you have swelling, especially in the ankle, because it is a smaller joint, when you have swelling, that's going to decrease your range of motion. So your first goal in rehab is going to be to eliminate swelling so you can increase your motion. Your ankle moves in 4 directions. It points down, which is plantar flexion, points up, dorsiflexion, in and out, inversion and eversion. So you're going to need to regain all of your range of motion before you can even start strengthening, because without flexibility, there's no mobility, and you have to be mobile before you can be stable. So once you get your range of motion back, then that's when you can start trying to focus on, calf strengthening and tibialis strengthening and single leg exercises, balance, working on getting his proprioception, things like that. But we don't know kind of where he's starting from. So we kind of don't know his progression and how long it's going to take. But that's generally, the manner in which you kind of progress.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. Well, of course, the Colts are hoping Wentz plays this week and doesn't miss any time. But, of course, like you said, we don't know. Nobody really knows except for the Colts. But right. Another quarterback.
That's how I'd have
it. What's that?
I said that's how I would have it. I mean, that way the team doesn't know how to prepare.
That's true. But another quarterback that was having a good start of the season has to sit out a minute, and I'm sad for him because he was having a great start to the season. And that's Tyrod Taylor. Of course, he was playing well, made a run Sunday, grabbed his hamstring. I think the issues got him on the IR now, the short-term IR for at least roughly 3 weeks. I hate it for him, but of course, how serious could this injury be? With him missing time with the hamstring, 3 weeks, things like that. How serious could it really be?
I mean, they're pretty painful, and then you also have to think, when you look at hamstring injuries, a lot of athletes who have them, it's usually a recurring thing. Like I don't know his medical history, but I would guess that this isn't the first time that he's pulled his hamstring. Basically the hamstring, it's going to be an overstretching of the muscle that kind of creates little micro tears in the hamstring, which is a collection of 3 muscles on the back of the leg. But most people, when it happens, they complain of a real sudden pop or a tearing sensation in the back of their leg. Most people who pull their hamstring, they absolutely know they pulled their hamstring. It's one of the most painful things that I've ever heard people talk about. So some people would be like, oh, I pulled my hamstring. No, a lot of times when people pull their hamstrings, they're usually not walking off. They're usually being kind of helped off, because if it's a severe enough pull, a lot of people can't even actively straighten their knee. Right? So it's a lot of swelling. It's a lot of tenderness. Sometimes, depending on how bad it is, there's discoloration in the back of the leg. And it's also measured by severity. You can have a mild strain, a moderate strain, or a severe strain. And if they're talking 3 weeks just off of the bat, it's probably somewhere in the moderate range. So, for the first week or 2, they're just going to keep them off of rest, ice it, anti-inflammatories. Once he's able to kind of move it, walk on it, with a little less pain, they might move into kind of working him through massaging, trying to stimulate blood flow, get rid of scar tissue, and then they can kind of work on seeing where he's at that stage, working on getting him back. But it's very painful acutely. And more often than not, if you have a moderate to severe hamstring pull on a Sunday, you won't be back the following Sunday. Not playing quarterback.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, you definitely answered the things. Of course, you'd have to do in rehab in terms of like massaging and things like that. Are there any other things he can do in terms of trying to rehab it to get back?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people and a lot of therapists and orthopedic surgeons in the field, they seem to attribute the hamstring pull to muscle imbalances around the joints. So back to anatomy, your hamstrings are two joint muscle. They cross at your hip and your knee. So they're responsible not only for knee flexion, bending your knee, but also hip extension. So it's the main decelerating muscle in the leg. So when you're doing a lot of sprinting or you're running, or for him, when he's scrambling or leaving the pocket or trying to make plays with his legs, and he goes to either slow himself down after going really, really fast or change direction after going really, really fast, if you don't have the correct muscle balance, as far as strengthen the quads, strengthen the hips, strengthen your hamstrings, that can lead you predisposed to pulling your hamstrings. And it's very common for athletes to have the muscle imbalance. A lot of people don't like to stretch their hamstrings. They just like to go out there and start working out. A lot of people prefer to strengthen their quads and their hips, versus strengthening the hamstring. Nobody's just running to go and get on the hamstring machine. Even the average person, when you're talking about even the average person that likes to work out, so many people jump into a new routine without having the correct muscle balances around their lower body. And that's how people predispose themselves to injury all the time. But it's so common in the hamstrings because nobody really works their hamstrings like they're supposed to. So whoever's doing his rehab will probably do a functional movement assessment on him, kind of assess, his strength and his flexibility of his hamstrings versus the strength and flexibility of his quads, his glutes, things like that, just to make sure things are in order, because it doesn't matter how strong you are. If you're not flexible, you're not going to be able to move. So.
Gotcha. Okay, let's say he does come back and he's still kind of not comfortable on his hamstring. That kind of what things would he be limited? He'd probably be limited to the things he could do in terms of leaving the pocket, things like that. Correct? Would it limit like his passing as well?
It just depends. It depends on how his pain is. You got to think of the things that are his strengths and what he's used to being able to do. And, you kind of, even if he comes back, you don't want to put him into a position where he's not playing the position like he naturally would, which isn't necessarily just standing back there and throwing the ball. So he's going to want to get that hamstring all the way well, because that's another injury that has a high reoccurrence rate. When people try to come back prematurely from a hamstring pull, they almost always re-pull it, and then they're back at square one. So when you're talking about the leader of your team, that's not really anything that you want to be lingering. You don't want him to come back in 2 weeks and then, a month down the line, he pulls it again, because that's just not him not being able to run and move around and decelerate and do the things that he's great at. That's just not something that he'll be able to do with a recurring pulled hamstring.
Gotcha. Well, you definitely have answered my questions when it comes to Tyrod Taylor and Carson Wentz. Carson, another injury, another month, another injury for him. And, of course, Tyrod Taylor, he gets his chance, he's playing well, and then this happens. It just seems like those things keep happening in his career. But hopefully,
yeah. At least he doesn't have a punctured lung this time. So that's
yeah. That one is one of the strangest sports injuries. Or you just wonder if they did it on purpose. I in my mind, I keep wondering that. But
that was so random.
Very much. Well, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on, and we're gonna keep rooting on the Seminoles, just like I'm gonna keep rooting on the Vols. But
Man, it's hard, man. We're 0-3. I think only us and like Arizona are the only Power 5 schools that don't have a win. I mean, it's hard right here, as you can't see, but I'm repping Emory, my other school, today. So
well, I'll tell you this: the Tennessee Vols are 2-1, but they also got to remember they're getting ready to go into the SEC schedule, and they don't have a game that's probably going to be like a cupcake game until November.
so y'all haven't had a conference game yet?
Nope. And the first one is Florida this Saturday, so that'll
God.
be nice and fun.
I remember when that used to be a good game, a competitive game.
Yeah, it might be a little interesting this Saturday. And not necessarily a good way.
I wish you guys the best.
Thanks. Same to the Seminoles. Hopefully they'll get it back rolling.
We got Louisville this weekend, so they put up a lot of points last week against UCF and came out with the victory shot. And I'm gonna do a little bit of praying this weekend, so we'll see.
You gonna break out the voodoo doll as well? I'm just kidding.
Don't practice that.
But thank you for your time. Got to wrap everything up, and you've been watching 20 or listening. I'm sorry, to 20 AFC South with your host Mike Patton.